Hello again, and welcome back to my channel. I'm continuing straight on from yesterday when I was talking about puffin books and their importance in my life. I want my coffee, which is on the floor over there. Jeremy's just left me coffee, but I can't get to it because of Socks being fast asleep, although I think he's pretending to be fast asleep. Can you see him? Oh. Yeah, that's a fake sleep. He just likes sitting there while I talk. And when I read, he looks up as if I'm talking to him, as if I'm reading the story to him. The pile of puffins that I collected up is kind of random. They're just from my shelves in my study. They're not even the ones from my bookcase in the bedroom where the essential ones are, where The Dark is Rising is, or Carrie's War. They're all essential, of course. This one, Cricket in Times Square by George Selden, is something I discovered in 2009 for the first time. And it's part of a series, it turns out, about these creatures that live on the streets of New York. It's a kind of Wind in the Willows, but whereas that's a whole bunch of Edwardian homosexuals living by the riverbank in the middle of the English countryside, this is a bunch of New Yorkers who live in the tube system, the subway, who live hand to mouth, eating bits of food dropped by people in the by the newspaper store, owned by a family called, I forget the name of the family, but I'll read the beginning. A mouse was looking at Mario. The mouse's name was Tucker, and he was sitting in the opening of an abandoned drain pipe in the subway station at Times Square. The drain pipe was his home. Back a few feet in the wall, it opened out into a pocket that Tucker had filled with the bits of paper and shreds of cloth he collected. And when he wasn't collecting, scrounging as he called it, or sleeping, he liked to sit at the opening of the drain pipe and watch the world go by. At least as much of the world as he hurried through the Times Square subway station. Tucker finished the last few crumbs of a cookie he was eating, a Lorna Doone shortbread he had found earlier in the evening, and licked off his whiskers. Such a pity, he sighed. Every Saturday night now, for almost a year, he had watched Mario tending his father's newsstand. On weekdays, of course, the boy had to get to bed early, but over the weekends, Papa Bellini, that's the name, let him take his part in helping out with a family business. Far into the night, Mario waited. Papa hoped that by staying open as late as possible, his newsstand might get some of the business that would otherwise have gone to the larger stands. But there wasn't much business tonight. The poor kid might as well go home, murmured Tucker Mouse to himself. He looked around the station. The bustle of the day had long since subsided, and even the nighttime crowds returning from the theatres and movies had vanished. Now and then a person or two would come down one of the many stairs that led from the street and dart into the station, but at this hour everyone was in a hurry to get to bed. On the lower level the trains were running much less often. There would be a stretch of silence, and then the mounting roar as a string of cars approached Times Square, then a pause while it let off old passengers and took on new ones. And finally the rush of sound as it disappeared up the dark tunnel. And the hush fell again. There was an emptiness in the air. The whole station seemed to be waiting for the crowds of people it needed. I love the way it's described, almost like the river in The Wind in the Willows, this surge of people through the underground tunnel. So it's a mouse and a cat and their adventures, basically. Later books, there's a puppy that they adopt. They're all wonderful. Selden also wrote the genie of, I forget the name of the place he comes from, Sutton Place, also set in New York. And under a pseudonym, he wrote an extremely rude novel for adults that's well worth looking up. Norman Hunter and his Incrediblania stories This is Count Backwards on the Carpet and Other Incredible Stories. These used to be read on Jackanory by Kenneth Williams, who would come on very primly and sit there and just pour forth with these ridiculous stories. It took me years to realise which books they were. He always gives the impression of making them up on the spot, out of his head, and of course that was never true. They were beautifully rehearsed with fantastic voices for all the characters, and there is a incredible zest to Norman Hunter's storytelling and absurdity to all of it. He also wrote the Professor Brainstorm series, which is mostly forgotten now, apart from the fact that they did 2 special episodes at different Christmases in recent years with Harry Hill playing Professor Brainstorm brilliantly, more like Doctor Who than Doctor Who's been for about 30 years. Anyway, in the royal carpet cupboard, where they kept the special red carpet for rolling out to welcome distinguished visitors, stood the wicked Count Backwards. And he wasn't there to see if the carpet needed cleaning, which it didn't, as the Queen had it swept and brushed and beaten and vacuum cleaned every other day, because she couldn't bear the idea of anything not being as clean as 7 whistles and 5 hospitals, whether it was used or not. And he wasn't there to measure it in metres to make sure it had enough yards to go round, or rather go down the steps in front of the palace. Oh no, he was there for a low-down, dastardly reason. He was tampering with the royal carpet, which is one of the dastardliest things you can do in Incrediblania. Ha ha, he, ho ho, chuckled wicked Count. The wicked Count, under his breath, in case anyone was listening at the keyhole, which they couldn't have been, as there wasn't one. And anyway, whoever would want to listen at the keyhole of a carpet cupboard? He chuckled again. That will do the trick nicely. That will put the King and Queen in a fix when their imperial visitors arrive. And he crept craftily away, leaving the royal carpet all secretly tampered with. I forget who the drawings are by. Is it Fritz Wenger? Which is a great name, wasn't it? Let's see. No, Babette Cole. And there he is, the dastardly Count. Right. Tales of the Greek Heroes, Roger Lancelin Green, another great favourite. All of his versions of everything I absolutely loved. And he did a version of Robin Hood. And this, of course, is it contains the Golden Fleece. All the stories that I loved as a kid. He did Ancient Egypt, which is here somewhere in this pile, and the Nordic myths and King Arthur. He does them brilliantly, because what he does is link the stories together, these kind of pocket myths. He shows how everybody's related to everybody else, how one cycle of stories fits within another and makes the next story inevitable in a way. The consequences of this story are paid off over here. It's kind of very valuable stuff to learn about, really, how stories link up, how stories lead to each other. And I think he was fantastic at doing it. Here's something I read as a kid because my mum had them. We watched the TV version. K.M. Payton's Flambards series. Flambards in Summer, Edge of the Cloud, and the first one, Flambards. Now, it looks like a whole bunch of posh people with horses and big houses, which of course it is, but it's also tragic. It's around the First World War, and it's very moving. I read them again very slowly in recent years. It begins with 12-year-old orphan Christina is sent to live with her Uncle Russell and his 2 sons in their old country house, Flambards. It is a strange, unruly household that Christina grows up in during those days before the First World War, one she comes to love, hate, and be inextricably bound up with. Oh, I can hear the spine of the book cracking. Yep, I don't know if Flambards is still around in print. I hope so. Here's something that people do know about, because Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, I think it was a Cure song, wasn't it? They took the title. But it's a time travel story. One of those very strange romances in which somebody in the present day falls asleep and wakes up as themselves in a different time. It's a great story shape, which is a term I prefer to trope. And there's lots of them, isn't there? Alison Utley's Traveller in Time, where she goes back to the Renaissance. In a way, Tom's Midnight Garden by, who wrote that? Somebody will tell me, will remind me. Is that as well, isn't it, where he goes into the mysterious garden? That's outside of time somehow. By bedtime, all the faces, the voices, had blurred for Charlotte to one face, one voice. She prepared herself for bed very slowly and deliberately, cleaning her teeth with the new green toothbrush, undressing awkwardly because she did not like to hide herself in the washing cubicle with her fellow new girl, Susanna. But she was, on the other hand, much too shy and strange to undress as openly as the other three, Vanessa, Janet and Elizabeth. See, it's written with a kind of complexity and a denseness. You're pitched straight into the minds of these characters as soon as the book opens. It's interesting. There's my Robin Hood. Roger Lancelin Green, Robin Hood. I first read this, I don't know when. I think it was his versions of all the myths that I read first of all. And this became, of course, very useful. It was extremely useful. Amongst all the books about Robin Hood I used and read and dipped into for my version of Robin Hood that I did for Doctor Who. Nicholas Fisk. Now, A Rag, a Bone and a Hank of Hair is, I think, a later one by him, perhaps. We're into the 80s. Earlier, he did ones that we hoarded as kids at Wood and Burn Juniors. Now, these are brilliant editions, trillions, in which loads of little things arrive on Earth. The heavens open, and out of the blue drift upon drift of tiny, hard, shiny objects, trillions, capable of what strange achievements, containing what unknown power. Wherever do they come from? And are they a blessing or a disastrous invasion? Nobody knows, and a boy with a microscope is just as likely to find out the answers as all the scientific pundits. Now, that's an important thing about science fiction for kids, I think, or adventure stories for kids, that a clever child with her wits about her, and a microscope or a willingness to learn is just as capable of solving the mystery as any of the scientific or authority figures. Strikes me as well that Trillions is, it did at the time when Doctor Who did a story very like that in 2013. Not a very good story. And I forget, it was a Chris Chibnall one. Anyway, I forget what it was called, but it was the same kind of little nuggets of things arriving mysteriously. What are they for? Time Trap. And Space Hostages, where a whole bunch of people are taken from a town, including the school bully, and whisked off into space. And Grinny, the one where Granny is replaced by a terrible presence. It's very, very creepy, that book. And there was a sequel which I've got somewhere. There's Roger Lancelin Green's Tales of Ancient Egypt. Beautiful cover. These are really peculiar. This is where mythology became quite spooky for me, because the Egyptian ones are all about death. I mean, they're all about death. Myths are always about death. But there's something about the Egyptian ones that were extra specially spooky. The Amazing Mr. Blunden, Antonia Barber, which I remember from the movie and then read the book after. The Pie Makers, Helen Cresswell. I've read lots of her. Anti-Robbo by Anne Scott Moncrief. This is a kind of earlier puffin in that genre of I've got a crazy auntie leading us off onto adventures. A Wrinkle in Time, Madeleine Engel. That's a really beautiful edition, beautiful cover. It was a dark and stormy night in a small village in the United States. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wraith-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else, on top of me, on top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of the teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I can't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be, can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she'd fooled around a little to try and make herself feel better, and one of the girls said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't babies anymore. Why do you always act like one?" I loved this the first time and the second time I read it. I didn't get on with the sequels, actually. I had a beautiful edition of the second book, and I gave it away because I hadn't enjoyed it as much. I wish I had. There's something very particular about the atmosphere of A Wrinkle in Time. The Railway Children, Edith Nesbit again, and this is slightly obscure, Golden Goblet. It's an adventure story set in ancient Egypt about a little boy, and it's a kind of Aladdin story, I think, about breaking into tombs. It's by Eloise Jarvis McGraw, and it's a book from the 60s. Beautifully written, very vivid and descriptive. That's the thing, I guess, that the Puffin books had. They were incredibly descriptive, and that, I suppose, is a bit out of fashion now. When I read middle grade books that are picked out as things like Waterstone's pick of the month or whatever, or the things that win prizes, they're kind of more sparely written. The things that are still like Puffins, that are still kind of densely written, I don't quite get on with either. I'm thinking of people like, is it Frances Hardinge and, Catherine Rundell. And when I've tried their kids' books, they felt a bit overdone to me, a bit overwritten, like compensating too much, maybe. And slightly stodgy, perhaps. Or written for the adult gatekeepers of the kids' writing world, you know, books that appeal to librarians, which is a genre, I think. The kind of things kids should like, but maybe don't. There's got to be something between that and the very plainly written computer game type books that are everywhere. Here's someone I love, Catherine Patterson. This particular one, The Great Gilly Hopkins, I didn't discover till recently. I knew about The Bridge to Terabithea, which is a wonderful book, but this is magic. Again, another one of these very rebellious, cross characters that many of these books begin with, like Wrinkle in Time does. And yeah, Gilly Hopkins is a tough operator. She's super cool and super intelligent. And Gilly's not going to be had by anyone, teacher, social worker, or foster parent. All she wants is a reunion with her beautiful long-lost mother. But just when it seems her dream might come true, things no longer seem quite so clear-cut. "Gilly," said Miss Ellis with a shake of her long blonde hair towards the passenger in the back seat, "I need to feel that you are willing to make some effort." Galadriel Hopkins shifted her bubblegum to the front of her mouth and began to blow gently. She blew until she could barely see the shape of the social worker's head through the pink bubble. This will be your third home in less than 3 years. Miss Ellis swept her golden head left to right and then began to turn the wheel in a cautious manoeuvre to the left. Yep. Worth a reread soon, I think. It's my copy of the BFG, which I love, but when I read the biography by, I forget his name, it's a biography that came out in the late 90s, where he described, I think it was by his editor, and he described the super editing that he did on Dahl's books, almost as kind of more than editing, as kind of he was writing some of the text, because Dahl was less interested in the actual writing by then. It was kind of disappointing. And there is a difference between the Dahl in his kids' books of the 60s and 70s compared with the things that came afterwards with Matilda and the BFG, which do seem softer edged and more trained on a kind of mass audience, I think. The Moomins, Tove Jansson. I've read Finn Family Moomin Troll, Moominland in Midwinter. I've read this again and again. I've got a fancy edition somewhere. Probably my favourite is The Tales from Moomin Valley, because it moves around all these strange creatures. Moomin Popper at Sea. And somewhere there's the autumn one and the comet, and I've read them as well. I love them, and that's it. Sometimes some of the stuff around it, the kind of preciousness of everyone loving the Moomins, gets on my nerves a bit. I prefer these things when they're not owned by everyone, when it's, I go back to feeling like that, how I did when I was 8 years old, as if I just discovered these books and nobody else ever had. And that was an important feeling. So when you feel as if they've been adapted or loved by everyone or are kind of massively popular, it kind of spoils it. It's how, because then things come to dominate, don't they? It's like Harry Potter, where, people who didn't read read that, which is a good thing, I suppose, but it's not really. Such a snob. I was going to go through these as well. There's more to be gone through, at least 2 or 3 more series, but I will stop there, and I will see you again in the next episode. I don't know what I'll be talking about then. Today I'm just happy because I've written 1,000 words this morning. I've got back to my novel at last, and so I feel relatively free to spend the afternoon, another rainy afternoon, reading. Anyway, goodbye everyone. I'll see you again soon.